Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Littles. I am a Michigan native and a double Wolverine, graduating from Michigan Law School in 2016, and with a BBA from the University of Michigan in 2010. I had the great pleasure of being on the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, as well as being the 2015 co-chair for BOSSA. I currently am an associate at Bailey and Glasser in Washington, D.C. And today I have the great pleasure of being your moderator for our panel on the topic of reparations. This is a very a issue that is very near and dear to my heart. While in law school at Michigan, I had the privilege to be in a seminar called Poverty in the Law. And I wrote a very lengthy paper on reparations and the importance of getting reparations passed and how it can impact the African-American community. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing you all to two fabulous professors who know a lot on this topic, much more than I do. And we're going to have a very spirited conversation about the topic of reparations. Particularly, we want to look at the idea that the Michigan's former Congressman, John Conyers, introduced the bill, H.R. 40, the reparations bill, every session for 25 years while he was in Congress until he retired in 2017. And that bill never even made it to the floor for debate, despite who was in the majority. Yet in 2020, we saw several of the Democratic presidential candidates discussing reparations and proposing plans on how to actually make reparations work. And in 2020, we also saw a lot of consciousness on Black issues with the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. That's just to name a few. Many can say that we've had a country awakening. And so that begs the question, with this awakening on the systematic racism in our country, is reparations still relevant in 2021? And if it is, how can we actually make it feasible? Is it just a pie in the sky idea, or can we really overcome some of the possible legal challenges? And so I will now introduce our fabulous panelists who will go dive deeper into these issues for us, all right? So first, I will introduce Kim Ford Masuri, who is also a double Wolverine and a professor of law at University of Virginia. He is promoted to professor in 2001 at the University of Virginia and teaches constitutional law, employment discrimination, criminal law, and race and law. He is also the director for the study of race and law. His scholarship focused on equal protection, especially involving race and sexual orientation. And his publications have concerned what role race should play in topics such as placing children for adoption, whether and how to select racially and other demographically diverse juries, whether affirmative action policies that employ race-neutral means are constitutional, and whether America is morally obligated to remedy past discrimination, exactly what we're talking about today. His articles have been published in several prestigious law journals, including the University of Michigan Law Review, the University of Chicago Law Review, California Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, and Georgetown Law Review. Again, he is a 1993 graduate of the Michigan Law School and 1990 graduate with a BA in philosophies from the University of Michigan. We are so grateful to have you here today. My second panelist is Professor Julia Mortensen, and I actually had the distinct pleasure of being his student for not one, but two courses, constitutional law and legislation and regulations back in either 2013 or 2014, so a little while ago. But one of, I would say, my most impactful professors And just a little bit about Professor Mortensen. He is an engaged scholar and award-winning teacher. He specializes in constitutional and international law. His current book project, which is under contract with Harvard University Press, develops a comprehensive account of presidential power at American founding. He is also co-authoring a new constitutional law casebook for Foundational Press. Professor Mortensen is an active litigator and a representative on constitutional matters, where he served as lead counsel in a suit that required Michigan to recognize the marriages of more than 300 same-sex couples. And his work led to the appellate counsel for the Arab American Civil Rights League, a challenge to the Muslim ban. He has worked as one of the principal drafters of the merit brief in the landmark case which secured the rights of Guantanamo detainees to challenge their incarceration. He is a graduate of Stanford Law School, we won't hold that against you, and received an AB in history from Harvard College. So thank you both for being here today. I know that we're going to have a very spirited conversation about reparations. I think many people tend to think of this conversation as a very theoretical one that could not possibly be implemented, or possibly even a political issue, right? So I just want to start the conversation off, and I'm going to kick it off to Kim first to just talk a little bit about sort of the historical inequities to African Americans that have led us to this point where we're having a conversation about reparations, sort of the backdrop that necessitate reparations.
Sure, and thank you very much for being here. And go blue to my fellow alums out there. Was looking forward to seeing everybody in person last year. Unfortunately, it got canceled. I'm glad at least this year we're finding a way to communicate, and hopefully next year it will be in person again. I thought I'd bring a little bit of the reading room behind me for us all to enjoy, and hopefully doesn't bring back shudders. Anyway, yeah, well, it's such a huge question, but I think of our history as primarily one of oppressing Black people, comprehensively denying Black people opportunities to develop themselves educationally, in employment, in families, in capital, first obviously through slavery, then through Jim Crow. And across those, generations and generations, the pattern was sort of oppress and then just stop some aspect of it. So slavery is stopped, but then it's replaced by segregation, which was less oppressive, but still significantly oppressive. And then the civil rights movement achieved significant reforms. I wouldn't want to minimize that. But again, it was largely then stop affirmatively oppressing. But what we've learned, and perhaps didn't anticipate as much then as we have come to realize now, the hundreds of years of intergenerational injustice has created huge social and economic disparities, especially between African Americans and whites. Plus there's continuing, albeit less overt, discrimination. So Black people continue to suffer disadvantages at significantly higher rates than white people, and that's a consequence of that intergenerational oppression. So that's where we are today. And to the extent people think, well, didn't we solve this? Stopping the injustice does not repair the harm that was done, and we still have to do that.
I think that's a great point. And I think about specifically of issues where people like my grandmother, for example, who is still living today, she just turned 80 years old, and she was a sharecropper in Mississippi for, her primitive years. She moved to Michigan when she was 20 years old. and we think about the legacy of slavery and how, as you mentioned, just replacing that, we got rid of slavery, and then we had sharecropping, right, which was essentially another type of slavery, in many ways, because families couldn't own their own land. Typically, they were sharecropping on someone else's property, on old plantations, and so. And that's in her lifetime. So I think about what you're saying and how it still is relevant to a lot of us today. And some may say, okay, well, we've already implemented things such as affirmative action. And so affirmative action or busing for students to different school districts have sort of eradicated the issues that we've, as African Americans, have faced in this country. So I would love to hear a little bit about Professor Mortensen, Julian, if you would just comment on your thoughts about the way that these techniques, as affirmative action or busing, whether those have helped the gap, right? If they have. If they're a replacement for reparations and one that we don't need anymore, that we don't need reparations anymore because we've had things, solutions by the courts or solutions by the legislature to sort of eradicate the inequities caused by some of these prior actions.
Thanks, Brittany. And first, it's just terrific to be on a panel with both of you all. I've admired Professor Ford Mazrui Scholarship since I was literally in law school. And Brittany, it's just terrific to be able to sit on a panel with you after having such good memories of having you as a student and having you here in Ann Arbor with us. As to the question of whether the efforts made so far, however you think about classifying them, sort of the various efforts in the direction of social welfare, both race conscious and otherwise, since the civil rights movement, have done their work, have finished the work. I struggled to take that position seriously, which is to say, no, I don't think they have. It's sort of hard to look at any number of objective metrics or to live in this society and think that the work is done. That said, I think it's interesting to note how readily that instinct comes to mind for a great many people. I mean, white people, not only white people, but especially white people who react to the claims of further efforts, further race-specific efforts, as sort of being directed at a thing that we should be done with by now. I mean, I think of the final paragraph of the Michigan affirmative action case, the law school one, Grutter, and how the court is sort of blindly confident, and that actually might be the right word, but I was going to say blandly confident that we just need 24 more years and we'll have caught up. It's inconceivable to us that we'd need more in that amount of time. I mean, when you think about the entrenchment of a social structure and a racial hierarchy and the knock-on economic effects that just compound generation after generation, and you think about the scope of American history. And I mean, I always think about America's many things, but right, if there is an original sin, it's slavery. And then if there is a great promise that was broken, it's Reconstruction. And that's hundreds and hundreds of years going back to before independence that I just have trouble taking seriously the suggestion that if there's work of racial reparation to do, that we're done with it. I don't know how to understand that as a claim almost.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. What do you think the efforts that have been made thus far, what impact do you think they've made on our country and as far as the standing, if you will, of African Americans in this country?
Well, first of all, thanks for those kind words, Julian, and I'm very glad to meet you and also to see Brittany visually. Yeah, well, I just completely agree. I mean, the disparities are really quite stark. Just to give some examples, Black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to live in poverty. The numbers vary, but anything from 8 to 20 times less wealth on average than white families. Infant mortality for Black mothers and infants is 2 to 3 times that of white mothers, and that's even if you control for economic class. So one can't look at the state of racial disparity in America and think that we've repaired it. It would be like, burning down a building and then throwing a bit of water on it, and then it's still flaming and still smoldering, and thinking, well, we've thrown water on it, so it's its fault now. So tremendous work needs to continue to be done. I think affirmative action has helped, but it's really really a small slice of the pie, so to speak. Often it has helped to increase the size of the Black middle class, which is still significantly smaller proportionally than the white middle class. But there are many people who are living under circumstances where, going to a prestigious college, which is the kind of affirmative action that, gets the most attention, is not really a realistic life opportunity. They really need to get a good paying job and be able to live in a healthy environment and raise a family and, not get harmed by crime or not get attracted into a life of crime because they don't have other opportunities. So to the extent that's drastically still disproportionately experienced by people of color, especially Blacks and Indians, then the work is sort of patently unfinished.
I absolutely agree. I was doing a little bit of research before we had this panel, and to just affirm what you were saying, as of 2016, a recent study showed that the average white household had more than 10 times the median wealth of Black households. And this gap is not due to differences in behavior or even education. On average, Black households with a head who holds a college degree has 2/3 of the wealth of a white household with a head household who never finished high school. So it's exactly to your point, the disparities are real, and it's not just for a lack of trying, if you will. Some people like to say that many African Americans should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and really work harder to achieve some of the accomplishments that we see by many white Americans in this country. And so the question is how would or could reparations, I guess in the traditional sense, really impact the Black community or the standing there? And I'll open this up to either of you, because I think it's a real question, right? Like, if we're just saying that we're going to give money, how does that necessarily change the standing, if you will, of African Americans in this country, or the position of poverty, of lack of education, mortality rates, or death or baby mortality rates, things of that nature? How could reparations really change that? And I'll open this up to either of you.
Gosh, it's a big question. I mean, I it's interesting because it points to one of the questions about strategy, political strategy, and the process by which you could target a broad effort, if that's not a contradiction in terms, in ways that are comparatively more saleable politically. I mean, right, some obvious ones. I'm not advocating, I'm thinking out loud, which may be dangerous to do, but income thresholds might, I think, diffuse a lot of the, I think, very misbegotten, but a lot of the resistance to sort of an unfairness that might be perceived against political opponents. Another thing to think about might be, one way to think about reparations is targeted payments to individuals. Another possibility might be large block expenditures consciously racially targeted, whether on the basis of neighborhood or on the basis of subsequent access to the resources provided, right? So that there's some sort of government focus in a very big way that's done in a racially targeted way in the areas of greatest need or something like that. And so there's a mixture of like playing out the politics in your mind and the kind of hurdles that are likely to be in the way pragmatically. And then also the question of like, what does the best delivery system look like, as you say, to make a difference? I think those are tricky questions.
Yeah, and your question, I mean, I think you raised two questions. One is still back to the why question. So saying that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps is a way of saying that, the responsibility for continuing inequality is, that of Black people. For short, I'll say Black people. I mean, I think Black and Indians have been the most oppressed group, but other people of color have as well. But more of my knowledge has to do with Black people, so I don't mean to leave other people out. But and then the other question you asked is sort of how. And on the first question, Martin Luther King has a quote where he says, it's fine to ask someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but it's cruel to ask a bootless man to pull himself by his bootstraps. And so the challenge is persuading people to understand that the choices that we grow up with are significantly different depending on the resources we're born into, the educational and wealth resources of the families you're born into, the networks of your family, how the school system you grow up in, the neighborhoods and the housing and all that. And so it's not as if people just are all born in the same situation. And so it's just this individualistic merit that determines where people end up. I mean, there are rare stories of people who are rags to riches, but the reason they get so much attention is they're rare. Most people are significantly affected by the circumstances they're born into and the circumstances of society they grow up in. And that's true of white people too. There's a lot of white people who live under disadvantage and struggle, and it's no more their fault either for living in those circumstances. No one chooses what they're born into. And I just think white people who think Black people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps are failing to recognize the advantages they've had. That doesn't mean they haven't worked hard with what they were given, but on average, they're being born into more significantly beneficial circumstances. So we have a societal responsibility to improve the life opportunities of people of color because they are less because of what our society has done. The how is the hard question, but when you have a compelling moral obligation, the how is a matter of working it out, not a reason not to try. And it's tough because it's such a large scale problem. It involves so many different facets. One thing we could start is passing the John Conyers bill. I mean, why are we depriving ourselves of understanding the consequences of segregation? It reminds me of how, I don't know if it's still the law, but we're not supposed to research, at least federal funded research on the harms of gun violence. I mean, right. If something's worth doing, it's worth understanding its costs, not hiding from them. So, we need to gain information. Anyway, and in terms of how, I'm very skeptical of money for a couple of reasons. First, as Julian says, there is unfortunately a kind of political consideration where in some ways, with whatever you do, in some ways, the more targeted it is at the people who deserve it, the less palatable it's going to be to the people who wouldn't get the benefit. So, ideally, you would want to identify Black people who've been here several generations, who have most been impacted by a history of discrimination that might exclude or reduce any entitlement on someone like me, who's a first generation American. And perhaps you would target people who are most disadvantaged, but not necessarily, because the harms of the past can mean that someone who's currently a school teacher would be, a Bill Gates if it weren't for the past. But people are more sympathetic to helping people who are more economically disadvantaged. So maybe it does need to be targeted more based on financial need. Maybe it has to be, again, for political reasons, not for necessarily moral reasons. Maybe it has to be more race neutral in what it does, so that white people in similar circumstances also get the benefit. Notice that's actually less effective at targeting the racial harm that you're trying to target, but it's more politically appealable, because then you don't get the people who say, well, I grew up disadvantaged too, why don't I get a benefit? So those are some kind of strategic, as Julian points out, considerations. But another reason I'm skeptical of money is I just don't think it would be that effective. I think, and this is controversial to say, but I think part of the harm of oppression is depriving people of the kind of human capital and education and wherewithal to take advantage of money in a way that would actually improve the long-term chances of future generations, which is what we want. We don't just want a one generation payout. We want something that will actually transform Black families and communities to be in line with the way white families and communities are. And just giving people monetary payments, I don't think would necessarily be spent in the most appropriate way. So some degree of social engineering might have to be done, where it's funneled through, educational opportunities, home ownership, job training, things of that sort that are designed to help people develop themselves and future generations, rather than just give them money, which they might not spend in the most constructive way.
I think that's a great approach, is sort of looking at this as a more holistic solution versus just sort of throwing money at the problem. Julian, you mentioned, or perhaps it was Kim, but there was a mention of having sort of a targeted approach versus something where we allow, for example, targeting a low income community, right? Even though we understand that African Americans typically tend to be less wealthy than our white counterparts, perhaps targeting a lower income group could be impactful. What do you guys think about sort of that approach versus one that is racially based? And we'll talk about some of the challenges to a racially based approach, but I want to get your thoughts of sort of doing a more holistic targeting of a low income group. Do you think that would have the same sort of impact that we would like to see?
I think it's your turn, Julian.
Yeah. Gosh, I can't emphasize enough that I am not an expert on the structure of these things. And I'm just talking at this point. I can offer thoughts that are at least somewhat well-grounded. I'm thinking out loud with a lot of this stuff here. Sure, it'll do something. It'll do a whole great big whomping something, to the extent that it's a whomping amount of money. It won't, circling back to Kim's point, like the moral case is deprivation with harms that flow from the deprivation, and that there are worse harms and not so bad harms. Right, that's not even the right way to put it. That there are bad harms and really bad harms doesn't mean that, like that the not very bad harms should just be walked away from and treated like they're not there. I personally have sympathies in the direction of income redistribution generally. And so as I think about where the money does the most good, just for any government program, my instinct is to think that, well, if I'm going to spend $1, why don't I spend it on somebody or something who's not otherwise going to get the funding they would need for the purpose of this? So I have sort of a cross-cutting instinct in that direction. And the other thing that Kim said I think is really interesting is, I don't know how to characterize the suggestion he made in terms of like one overarching label for it, but it puts his finger like directly on a thing that I tie myself up in knots about on this, actually not so much on this question, I haven't thought about it so much on this question, but in other circumstances, which is like this tension between paternalism, right? We, the government, know what the best thing to do is for the medium long term. And so therefore we're going to direct monies in a way that might not be the same thing that lots of individuals would do if just direct payments were made. And an instinct that like actually a lot of times people do know what's best for them. And right, like some view that governments don't always acquit themselves well with making very big, large structural decisions. And I don't have a general position on that. I very strongly believe in organized government approaches to mustering focused attention on complex problems. Like I totally believe in that. But I react to Kim's, I think, forceful suggestion by thinking, I totally see that. I also wonder, right, I wonder what the person who is invested in individual autonomy and not being directed what's best for you by the government would think about that. I think it's a hard question.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, to that last point, it's been a while since I read Randall Robinson's book, What America Owes Blacks, but he suggested something kind of in between, kind of decentralized to local communities, but still not, I think, cash payments into individuals' hands. So it was like creating some sort of, I think, educational trust funds, for example. So there might be a way to kind of, there's still some degree of paternalism in that as to the individual, but where it's not kind of totally centralized, but local communities can come together and decide what kind of investments would most help their communities. And I'm forgetting the other question you asked, Brittany. I was so intrigued by Julian's last point that
I think
about focusing on lower income. Yeah, me too. I mean, I also believe in, attacking poverty. So it's hard to resist. If we could lift everyone out of poverty, I'm all for it. But to the extent we're not likely to do anything close to that, then it really becomes, how do we decide who we're going to help to lift out of economic disadvantage? And again, it's because I want to help everyone. I hate making those kinds of choices, but it depends on what your purpose is. Your purpose to kind of address economic disadvantage, or is your purpose to repair the wrongs of racial oppression? And those are two different goals. And if your goal is economic disadvantage, then you leave out middle-class Black people, even if they have been harmed by racial injustice, and you focus on economically disadvantaged people. But if we're saying that there's a moral responsibility, which I do believe in, to rectify the racial injustice, which manifests often in economic disadvantage, but among Black people, white people in economic disadvantage are unlikely to be there because of racism. It's so if you want to do racial repair, then you could focus on lower income people, but still add a kind of racial preference to who among the lower income people get whatever programmatic benefit you're trying to create.
I think that's a great point. Is what is the goal that we're trying to achieve here? I wanted to just circle back because Kim, you briefly mentioned when we're talking about the HR Bill 40 that John Conyers had introduced 25 years in a row. The main goal of that is just to do a study that will examine what has been the challenges over time and what have been the effects of the systematic racism, the lasting effects of race, of slavery and Jim Crow laws and other race-based laws that have impacted our community over time. And it would seem that partly that the reason why this has never even gotten to the floor to be voted on is because of the tension around race-based issues and our reckoning with slavery over time. And so that just leads me to what I think will be sort of a lot of your expertise, both of you, from a constitutional standpoint, is can we do something that is targeted specifically towards race from a constitutional standpoint? There's going to be challenges. We've seen challenges happening every day. I hear about new challenges to affirmative action. White students are challenging universities' affirmative action programs because they are race-based. So how can we realistically even promote a solution that is race-based legally? What are some of the challenges that we would face there? And are there any solutions that we could hope to have to get around those challenges?
Well, it's not right to put it on Julian to go first every time, but this time I know he was mentioned a second ago that's, and I know he could tell us about Croson and the like. So let me suggest Julian talk about race-based, and then I want to talk about race-neutral policies and why those would be constitutionally problematic also.
So on the race-based affirmative action front, I'd sort of divide between the question of the political realities of what this court is likely to do, and of what the current doctrine says and how lower courts have been applying it. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Croson case, the sort of the city affirmative action program in Richmond, Virginia, that's challenged and struck down. And so the case reads, it strikes the program down. The case reads quite hostilely toward affirmative action, and the demands it makes around specificity of a showing of harm in a particular instance, and possibly even something like a notion of guilt for the particular white contractors who lose out is, it's a very significant demand administratively, and set aside the legal and moral defensibility of it, but it asks a lot. And one of the most striking things about that to me is the case is early 1980s, and the African-American man who ends up with an entitlement to the contract under the affirmative action program, it's like literally born, raised, and educated in segregation. And yet the notion that you would anticipate or expect that an affirmative action program would be an appropriate mechanism to at least begin to tackle the legacy of that really is striking, to the extent that there's a demand of a very individual, almost common law causation style connection between injury and particular plaintiff. All right. All that said, one of the interesting things that I've learned in recent years that I really didn't know until fairly recently was how many affirmative action programs are still being deployed at the state and municipal level, and successfully, notwithstanding challenge. And so what the lower courts, at least that I've seen, I'm not making a categorical claim, I haven't done a deep study on it, but what the lower courts have done with the challenges to state affirmative action programs and city affirmative action programs is to demand some pretty thick showing of ongoing disparity that appears to be based on various controlling factors attributable to race. And so like New York City has a 350-page disparity report that it issues periodically, and New York State has a comparable disparity report, and the Indiana Department of Transportation has a disparity report. And these are like these aren't throw-offs. They hire research firms to come in to run numbers, to do regressions. They combine it with ongoing qualitative research. And so it turns out that, at least in a lot of cases, the way Croson has been applied, notwithstanding its sort of facial hostility, it's not generous even as applied, but actually turns out to allow programs to survive even strict scrutiny. The question, of course, is who can afford to do those kinds of studies and to organize those kind of studies and to make those kind of studies happen? To what extent is that a reasonable expectation and demand to have of the government units everywhere, as opposed to, one of the most important cities in the country, which is able to fund an entire effort devoted to just assessing this. So interestingly, at the present moment, race-based affirmative action in government procurement continues to exist and to also, this is the important part, withstand constitutional challenge.
Well, first of all, that's fascinating because I haven't followed the lower courts and did not know that. And because I read Croson, and in fact, it was in the supplement in law school. It had just come out to date myself the year before. And it's just, yeah, as you described it, devastatingly difficult to meet the precision that it seems to require. So that certainly creates difficulty for any overtly racially motivated policies by the Biden administration or any administration. Even if with appropriate studies, some programs can be upheld, it's still going to be a challenge for many programs to survive. So constitutionally, as the Supreme Court has interpreted it, race-based remedial policies are very difficult to do, especially if the use of race is significant. And even in higher education, it doesn't look good. After O'Connor retired, it didn't look good because Kennedy had never voted in favor of affirmative action. He decided to switch, but without Kennedy now and the makeup of the court, it's pretty hard to think we're going to get 5 votes to uphold affirmative action, even for diversity purposes. So it's definitely, that definitely means there's a already kind of interest in kind of thinking of race neutral policies. And I think that is going to be more politically, as I mentioned earlier, sellable if, white people can benefit as well. And I think constitutionally, but less constitutionally than I think people often realize. So part of my concern over the past couple of decades now is that the logic of equal protection doctrine treats race neutral policies in virtually the same way as it does race-based policies if there's a racial purpose behind it. You can certainly see this in kind of segregationist laws like the University of Mississippi raising its ACT score, or if a police department purposely used a test to screen out Black applicants, those would be struck down. And the court would just say, you can't discriminate through policies that are facially neutral if your purpose is to discriminate. And then with the Croson case, the court says, well, discriminating for the benefit of racial minorities counts as discrimination against whites. So it seems like the logic of the doctrine would say that then race neutral discrimination in favor of racial minorities is discrimination against whites. And there's been, one example, for example, would be that the University of Texas has a admission program based on state law that admits the top certain percentage of people who graduate in every high school. And that was designed to increase the admission of Latino and Black students. And it does have that effect. It's race neutral because it doesn't ask your race. It asks whether you were in, roughly the top 10% of your high school graduating class. So white students have benefited as well. But the purpose behind it was clearly to benefit Blacks and Latinos. So, there's a real question whether that would be subject to strict scrutiny. And then if the court really is moving towards a very strict version of strict scrutiny, then that kind of policy could be struck down. There's been some moves in that direction, like in the voting area. The court has struck down districts, even though they draw lines according to geography. But if there's a racial purpose behind it, the court has struck it down if the purpose is at least a predominant one. And in the employment context under a statute, the court has held that discarding a test because it has a racial impact, even if you're just going to redo the test in a different manner, constitutes discrimination against the whites who did better on the test. So the court is moving towards this position that any attention to race behind any kind of distribution of opportunities is viewed as discriminating against whatever group would be benefited if you hadn't taken account of race. So the lesson constitutionally and politically is you have to address issues in a race neutral manner without purposely doing it to benefit Black people, which makes for a fairly indirect and ineffective means for actually addressing the stark racial disparities that still exist in our society. So the law is challenging. I think I'll pause there. Let me just say then, it's also not. Let me make two suggestions. One, we have to be as rigorous as those on the other side in advocating for appointment of justices and judges who won't interpret the law in this colorblind way. That may take a while to change the nature of the courts, but we need to be patient. And then politically, we need to maximize turnout and do what we can to prevent these obstacles to people voting, because the more Black people and Black allies are a constituent that needs to be responded to, the more policies can be directed that are more beneficial to those communities.
Absolutely. And I think you really sort of got to the crux of it, which is this double-edged sword that you're almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if you try to implement policies, whether it's reparations or any other sort of comprehensive measure that will help to eradicate the inequities that have been overwhelmed the Black community and really have prevented them from, as we were saying before, sort of lifting yourself up by the bootstraps. But if you do anything that will help that, you're going to be essentially discriminating against the white community. And so I think that is sort of the crux of the issue. Julian, I would love for you to talk a little bit about and address this idea that we should be colorblind and utilizing a system or any remedies or mechanisms that have that are colorblind, if you will, that don't take race into consideration. How would you respond to that?
From a historical perspective, it's a claim that I find extremely frustrating. I think there's probably I know there's complicated policy questions about how best to structure any number of efforts to repair racial wrongs and other wrongs. The extent to which, Kim just described it perfectly, the constitutional equal protection infrastructure that has grown up over the last 40 odd years has come close to crowding out, or at least can plausibly be read as crowding out explicit attention to race in any useful way, as opposed to in ways that don't actually have a lot of leverage. It is grounded on this idea that the true legacy of Reconstruction and the true legacy of the effort to uproot and confront the conservative backlash during Reconstruction that ends up in the end destroying Reconstruction, that the signal theme is colorblindness is just false. It's just not right. Famously, the cases in just an introductory constitutional law course talk about the way in which the early cases, the way in which everybody knew that the particular object of concern of, forget the 13th and 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment was the freed slaves in particular, but African Americans in general, and the discrimination that was surely going to, and indeed already had started to emerge in the during the course of Reconstruction, the Reconstruction South. And there's any number of instances in which the very Congress, the same Congress that drafts, supports, and enacts for its part these Reconstruction amendments, is simultaneously enacting statute after statute that specifies delivery of benefits on the basis of race. I think the one that people are most familiar with is the Freedmen's Bureau Acts, which limit their the universe of people eligible to get benefits from the Freedmen's Bureaus to refugees and to former slaves, which of course an entirely racially defined category. But even to the extent that we want to push aside the Freedmen's Act statutes because they don't specifically enunciate a racial word. I mean, Congress in 1865 creates a bank that is only for freed slaves and their descendants. They're circling back to Kim's observations about the sort of lineal aspect, perhaps, of some approach to a modern version of reparations. They designate funds repeatedly for destitute colored women and children, specifically enunciating the race, as opposed to talking about a category oriented towards slavery. Lots of statutes that direct money, funds, and federal support explicitly on the basis of race in the terms they used then, as opposed to in relation to the status of being a former slave. I just don't know how you can work through this material and come away from it thinking colorblindness was what they were all about. It doesn't make any sense on its face. It wouldn't possibly have made sense on its face to them. You read what they say and it didn't make sense. And like the opposition throughout the Reconstruction Congress sounds an awful lot to opposition to these bills, sounds an awful lot like opposition to affirmative action and other racially conscious programs. So one of the quotes I really like is from Senator James Wilson Grimes of Iowa. There is aid and relief targeted specifically at African-American former soldiers, only African-American former soldiers. And the senator says, there is no reason we should pass a law such as this, applicable to colored people, and not apply it to white people. He also denounces the Freedmen's Bureau for making a distinction on account of color between the two races. He claims that it makes blacks superior rather than equal before the law. I mean, it's remarkable how the folks on the losing side of these debates over and over again during Reconstruction, when the amendments are put together and ratified, those are the voices that now we see reflected in the majority construction of the amendments. And those advocating that position now claim, apparently without embarrassment, that theirs is the historically correct interpretation when it plainly isn't. So that's the thing I get frustrated about. And so it just seems worth noting that if you hear people saying, well, of course, colorblindness is what they cared about, because that's just not true. It's just facially easily refutable with like 3 minutes of Googling.
And I would add two additional pieces I appreciated. You just said is, one thing that people who look to the original meaning of the Constitution do is look to what was state practice. Does that tend to, because that tends to show what they thought the amendment was doing. And a lot of the research the debate has focused over segregation in schools. And so there's a debate about, some states thought they had to desegregate, other states created separate schools. But where there's uniform consistency, especially across the South, is higher education was reserved for whites, especially in, the flagship schools. There might be some colleges, there were some land grant colleges that have become HBCUs based on a lot of federal funding. They tended to have more specialized, like agricultural or teacher training. But, all of the best colleges and universities in the South didn't admit blacks until, the second half of the 20th century. So that certainly showed that, that they believed they could be color conscious in admissions in higher education and have 100% quota for white people. So now to say like, oh no, the Constitution forbids admitting, 5% of the class based on race, when there's actually now a good reason to do so, is also inconsistent with how the amendment was interpreted originally. And then the other thing is, how you can often tell how to believe a position is look to the people who are most invested in the position and what do they come up with. For decades, Justice Scalia and then Justice Thomas have been advocating that the 14th Amendment should be interpreted by its original meaning and that it requires colorblindness. Well, they never present any evidence of that. Scalia can write for pages and pages and pages about the original meaning of the Second Amendment, but he just quotes Alexander Bickel to say race is immoral and we should never do it again. That's not an originalist source. So when the people who keep defending originalism and colorblindness don't actually come up with evidence for that interpretation, it makes you realize it's not out there.
That's a great point. And I even want to circle back to the idea that when we're thinking about reparations in particular, this is not something that is a novel idea, right? We've done reparations in one way or another for Native American individuals who are displaced. We've done it for the Japanese and Americans who were in internment camps. And so we've definitely done initiatives in the past, specifically reparations on a race-based, for race-based groups. And now it's being stopped because of these interpretations of the Constitution and the color blindness argument. I want to just quickly turn the conversation just a little bit to one that's not constitutionally based, but more of a politically based conversation. And that is one around what can this administration do to promote, whether it's reparations or if there's some other efforts that the Biden administration can be doing to help the African American community, whether that is by executive order or if that is just by pursuing other initiatives that can get to the goal that we want, and that is to uplift the African American community in this country. So are there any suggestions or ways that you can that you would give to the Biden administration to help with this effort?
I mean, one thing that jumps to mind immediately is directly responsive to the Black Lives Matter movement emerging over the last year, which is policing. I mean, you talk about a thing that is racially neutral. We need to engage with, investigate, reform, et cetera, civil rights violations in the course of doing policing. I mean, that's not a racially specific motive, and it speaks, the rhetoric of it speaks in ways that are universalizing, while simultaneously it not only can be defended, but is itself a moral obligation, at least in part because of the massive racial disparities in the system and in policing in particular. And that sort of feels like I was going to say low-hanging fruit. It's definitely not low-hanging fruit. It's a live wire politically, of course. But it just strikes me that, like, in terms of if the more ambitious notions of racially targeted reparation programs, whether financial or targeted government support programs, or I don't know, are sort of, it's hard to imagine current political circumstances with a 50-50 Senate, et cetera, something going through. That feels to me like a thing that, yes, it'll poke some hornets' nests, but that is a place where you can make a real meaningful difference with the right kind of investigation, legislative reform program, and the use of the Civil Rights Department of the DOJ. I'm sure there's lots of other stuff, and that's one that jumps to mind for me.
Yeah, criminal justice reform is big. I completely agree with that. Pushing for this George Floyd Act is a good start. And also the punitiveness of our incarceration system. There's rightfully a focus on policing, but we also, Blacks are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated. And the length of incarceration in America far exceeds what's necessary. 1 out of 25 people on Earth lives in the United States. 1 out of 5 people who lives in prison lives in the United States. I mean, we just have this this solution of putting people away, and other countries who have much lower percentages of people in prison and much lower sentences don't have appreciably higher crime rates. So that could be another, I think, focus of reform. And it means recognizing the humanity of people who actually commit serious crime. I think often there's a tendency to focus on, say, drug possession because it's nonviolent, and that should be addressed. But if we let out everyone in prison who's there for drug possession, there'd still be way too many people serving way too long. So we need to recognize that, you know, people make mistakes and they shouldn't be thrown away for decades, when a lot less would suffice. And you know, and we can know this. This is really a political problem, not a kind of, we don't really know what causes crime and how effective incarceration is. We also know that, for example, that people tend to age out after a certain age and much less likely to recidivate. So we shouldn't be keeping people in prison, you know, when they're past 50. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, so and then voting, as I mentioned earlier, because empowering people to vote, I think, addresses a lot of the concerns we've been talking about. Because for one thing, it can mean that there doesn't have to be a one solution fits all coming out of Washington. If people are active at the federal, state, and local level, then each community will be better and more responsive to their community's needs. It means policies, you know, will be more, it addresses the kind of autonomy concern, because policies will more likely reflect what the beneficiaries want. You know, reenacting the Voting Rights Act as a start. I know Biden's issued some order just recently about access to registering, you know, for federal law. And unfortunately, there's this resistance to voting that's also just extremely frustrating. That's always couched in terms of voter fraud. And you just, like, why does allowing people to vote on Sundays risk voter fraud? But you see states, you know, reducing days for voting. It's transparent what the motivation is. It's political and it's racist. So I hope Biden pushes for criminal justice reform and election and voting reform.
I just want to jump in on two quick things. I just want to reaffirm and say yes, hooray, about two things that Kim just said. The first is, and I just love people saying it out loud and embracing it and leaning into it, like recognizing the humanity and dignity, even of people who've done things that aren't simply possession of drugs, who've committed violent crimes, who've done things that we wouldn't think of as being untroublesome. And yet, right, the time goes on and people can and do change is one. And two, the statistics on the logic of keeping people, caging people, holding people forever doesn't make sense. I just think that's such an important point. And, you know, as much as I agree with the discourse around, you know, decriminalizing various, you know, nonviolent drug possession and that kind of stuff, that makes sense to me. That doesn't capture all the problem, nor does it capture in some ways like a key moral element to. And then the voting thing, I think that like the discussion of voting is the right that's preservative of all of the rights. It's wonderful. There's this great passage from Brittany. I'm not going to cold call you, but like, when we talk Katzenbach versus Morgan, and the way in which a statute that's enacted by Congress is meant to, or in its application, is meant to ameliorate discrimination against Puerto Rican population in New York. And there's no question that what New York is doing is discriminating against Puerto Ricans in the first instance, back with the sorts of literacy tests that are in play. And I love the court's discussion there, because the court talks about the banning of literacy tests. Yes, in terms of getting rid of a particular form of discrimination. So that's just like targeting the discriminatory thing and getting rid of it. But the part that I love about that opinion is sort of the raw political common sense of it. It's also a way to remedy any other number of moments of racial discrimination in the provision of city municipal services throughout the whole community, right? Police services, fire services. You know, a really good way to make the government more responsive to needs of communities, promote the representation of the people from those communities in the government. So this is a very, I love that opinion, because it's just very pragmatic about the leverage that increasing access to the ballot, that providing an in for excluded or somewhat excluded communities into the process, not in any virtuous way of, yes, now we shall heal racism, but like, you know what, we're not going to get these votes if we don't do this thing that's going to stop discriminating in the following way. Like that's a really powerful political crowbar to prise open doors that are hard to open. And I think the voting point is really important.
The voting point is extremely important, and I am pleased that we're also able to sort of call out the disparities that are happening there, right? Like we need people who we need to enforce and create ways to have more access to voting. But on the same side, where states are creating these or trying to pass at least restrictions on voting. So you see the double-edged sword again that we are faced here when trying to move these initiatives forward. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask him to just, if you wouldn't mind, telling our viewers about the George Floyd Act. I know there's been a little bit of attention that's been going to this, but I'd like people just to know a little bit more about that, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of education about that.
Well, unfortunately, I should have boned up on it before.
That's okay. I put you on the spot.
I mean, I think one of the significant things is qualified immunity. I believe it has a provision to strip police officers of qualified immunity. You know, that's a tough issue. There are legitimate reasons to worry about. You know, police do a dangerous job, and can make good faith mistakes that in hindsight may have crossed a line. But so I think there is a justification for some level of qualified immunity in theory. The trouble is the court has interpreted it in such a highly protective way, where police can do pretty obviously outrageously wrong things. And if there isn't like an identical case dealing with that exact behavior in the past, then courts say it wasn't clearly established. Oh, so that's too high a bar. So I would say lowering the bar, and even getting rid of it altogether, I think police would still be protected. First of all, I think this is about money damages, and police departments would generally indemnify police officers as they already pay to settle these cases, at least in any case where the officer's situation is even a little bit sympathetic. And then also there's already just a built-in qualified immunity in how grand juries and juries and prosecutors respond to police. So even if they had no official immunity, there's already a kind of bias in their favor. So I think getting rid of it completely would still, you know, it may actually strike the right balance. One thing I wanted to go back to, though, is also the combination of criminal justice and voting. To me, one of the most unjustified policies that most states have is to disenfranchise people because they've been convicted of a felony, and I've just never read anything persuasive. Other than just kind of a bumper sticker, like you forfeited your right. There's no evidence to suggest that people who have committed a crime and served their time. I mean, there are actually even a couple of states that allow people to vote while they're incarcerated. They wouldn't be doing that if it was causing some terrible problem that's never articulated. But even if you want to wait till someone has served their time, then they've served their time. In terms of fairness and also in terms of the beneficial consequences, we don't want people to recidivate. So we should want to welcome them back into being full members of the community. I'm talking about voting, but I would and I think that's probably the most important disability that's imposed on formerly incarcerated people. But I would also add other so-called collateral consequences should not aren't justified, like depriving people of right to public benefits or employment. So anyway, so that's another thing that I would like our system to recognize and target. It's a tough sell. People are happy to, again, just dehumanize and throw away people who've been convicted of a serious crime, but when they've served their time, they should gain their rights back.
I absolutely agree. So I think we're about at our time, but I want to just sort of open up the floor for any last thoughts or things that you'd like to leave our group with about this discussion about reparations. I know for me, one of the big takeaways that I sort of started with, but has been reaffirmed by our discussion here today, is the importance of getting a bill passed that will really look into all of these issues that we discussed, whether it is policing and whether it is voting, how all of these issues impact the African American community, and really just studying those issues to understand what steps we need to take forward. As Julia mentioned, there's the New York Disparity Report, right? That really at least goes into what the issues are and how they can address them. And perhaps the country is afraid of doing that because it will really shine a spotlight on what needs to be done. And if you don't have that information, then you can avoid it. But that is the big takeaway for me. And this time I'll start with Kim. What are your takeaways for this conversation?
Well, I really appreciate it. Let me maybe just add a couple of thoughts to leave people with. One is we have an empathy gap in our society that's exacerbated by the degree to which people still live very separate lives along racial lines. And one of the things, people are motivated by political pressure, people are motivated by morality, people are motivated by fear and anger and anxiety. People are also motivated by empathy if people understand other people's circumstances. So a bold idea, but it could maybe be broken into smaller chunks, would be to consider some sort of national civil service. We have a lot of infrastructure needs and environmental needs and child care and elder care needs in this society. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And if some sort of like AmeriCorps for all, or AmeriCorps for all who want it, where people would be brought from different communities to work together for common purpose for a certain period of time. There are some other countries who do it. And that could help people get to know people from different racial, religious, economic, regional backgrounds. And maybe that could also, over time, help to bring people together for common interests. And then the final point I want to talk about is intersectionality, and especially women. By intersectionality, I mean how people embody multiple identities, and those identities together can create unique experiences. And so Black women, for example, I think experience things unique to being Black women. That's true for Black men as well, and other intersections. And also gay Black people, trans women suffer excessive violence. So part of responding to the needs of Black people is also recognizing that we may need to think about sort of subgroups within Black people and what their particular needs are. And one group that's a majority of Black people is Black women. And I'll conclude with a provocative point, and I'll post an updated draft on the internet probably within the next few days. I'm writing an article called Why the Equal Rights Amendment Would Endanger Women's Equality, Lessons from Colorblind Constitutionalism. And it basically takes a lot of what we've discussed today about how the court's colorblindness now is an obstacle to reducing racial inequality. And I fear that as the Equal Rights Amendment is currently drafted, which was 100 years ago, it's just sort of tells states and the federal government not to discriminate on account of sex. And it doesn't say much more than that. And I fear that it would be interpreted by the court to push towards a kind of sex blindness jurisprudence. And a lot of the disparities between men and women require sex conscious attention to those policies, whether it's paid maternal or parental leave, or addressing disparities in pay, violence against women, et cetera. So I think one way to benefit women, which of course includes Black women, is to frankly oppose the ERA. And in my article, as well as Catherine McKinnon of Michigan Law School and Kimberly Crenshaw have written, they proposed a much more empowering ERA. A lot of European countries have equal rights amendments that people cite to, but they don't seem to realize that those amendments are very different. They have express authorizations and in some cases requirements that the government address sources of inequality between men and women and promote representation of women in corporate, in some cases, political institutions. So a majority of Black Americans are women, and I think the ERA would be damaging to their interests. So, and that's, again, because of the way the court treats race. So I encourage people to consider reading my piece, and feel free to email me any comments or criticisms. And thank you very much for your attention, and I've appreciated this discussion.
That's wonderful. And I think we've learned so much about different historical bills in the past, but as well as things that are relevant to us right now. Julian, what would you leave with our viewers?
Well, first is I can't wait to read this paper.
Yeah,
I've definitely never thought about this before, but it's right. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. You think about the threat to affirmative action under Title VII and so forth. That's exactly right. I've never thought about that before. I'm looking forward to reading this paper. That's great. More generally, it's just truly a pleasure and an honor to have a chance to talk about this stuff with you all. I don't know if I have great big substantive thoughts to land on. Certainly, I don't feel like I have any greater insight, and a lot less insight on the policy challenges and so forth of how to structure some approach to the problems that still plague us. I circle back to something that I tell myself and think to myself, and part of the time believe and try to believe, in the face of a sense at times that the problems are very big and that the challenges are very great, and that we've seen a lot of what looks like backsliding, and a lot of reason to have to feel downcast, or to feel like on whatever the thing that you care about with respect to justice, racial equality and reparations very much among them, like the task is enormous. And the thing I tell myself on the days when I've been working on some project, you mentioned the Muslim ban case earlier today, Brittany, and the days that are poured into it and the weeks that are poured into it, and think, what did it go to? What did it come to? What's happened with it? We all can do just what we can do. And first and foremost, take care of your loved ones and your family and so forth. And then the rest of the problems are very, very large in this world. And the thing that I tell myself, I'm talking my way around it, is you do the work, you go to bed, you get up and you do the work again. And that's not a promise that the work is going to pay off in any particular instance. So your job is to do the work, go to bed and get up and do the work again within the limits of the obligations we have to family and friends and loved ones. And when things seem hard, I remind myself of that. And so I guess that's what comes to mind when you ask what other thoughts in this area come to me.
I think that's a great point. And I think that kind of sort of circles back, and that we need to continue to have these conversations, whether it's about reparations or other ways that we can be impacting our community. And I think we've talked about lots of different things that are happening, bills that are coming forward, things that we should just be conscious of. So continuing to educate ourselves, continuing to talk amongst our community about these issues, continuing to bridge and have understanding amongst our communities will help to go a long way. So sometimes it's not necessarily the big thing that we want to happen, right? It's not like we've created a reparations bill, but we are doing incremental things that will help to make our community better and make our country better. So I think that's just one way to bring it all back together, is just the education piece and continuing to work together in ways that we haven't necessarily done in the past. So I just want to thank you both for being here today. Thank the law school for setting this up for us, and I'm really excited about the reunion and all the education and connecting that we will do during that time as well. So thank you two again. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.
Nice to meet you, Julian. Good to see you, Brittany. Go Blue.